Howdy, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Okayest Trapper podcast. As always, we are brought to you by some great sponsors: Cryptech, Blokes, Modern Men's Health, Mountain Tough Fitness, and Trapline Beard Oil. Do me a favor, go and leave a 5-star review on whatever platform you're tuning in from, and use the promo codes to get some great discounts from some of these great brands. Now, today's guest is a fellow adult onset hunter and trapper by way of Wisconsin. He's been focused heavily in the 2A industry and happens to also be the technical director for Henry Repeating Arms. Tom Kotz, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Zach. I appreciate it.
Yeah, I know we kind of went back and forth, and you carved a little time out for me. And one of the reasons I'm really interested in chatting with you, amongst everything lever action rifles, especially in the terms of like using them for dispatching animals on a trap line, is the fact that you yourself are now a trapper. So I think that's an amazing thing, and we'll get into it. But first, the question I ask every single guest out of the gates is, thinking back through your lifetime, can you remember the first time that you were ever exposed to anything related to trapping?
I was quite young. I was not in a place where I was able to pursue it at the time, but my grandfather was a trapper back in the Depression era. In fact, he used it to get money to put food on the table as a kid in the 20s and 30s. So my earliest recollections of that were, I must have been 2, 3, 4 years old when I knew there was an area in the basement that he used for skinning. But we lived in an urban area, so those were bygone days, and it was just a foggy memory as far as most people were concerned in that area.
Well, that's an awesome experience, with Grandpappy, ultimately, because I got to say, the accent probably gives it away a little bit on where you're from originally, but I'm going to go and guess maybe the New York, New Jersey area. Is that an accurate?
Yeah, Queens, New York, which in his day was a lot of swamp and farmland still. This would have been roughly around the JFK airport area, in those days, Idlewild. So there were a lot of corn farms and potatoes, from what I understand. A lot of German immigrants that were farmers, and he was heavily focused on the muskrat population. He was mostly a water trapper with the incidental raccoon catch, and in those days, raccoons brought good money, but he was mainly focused on the muskrats for the Jewish fur buyers in Manhattan who used the fur for trim for like traditional clothing. And also trapped snapping turtles in the swamplands, which I don't know what exactly the laws were in those days regarding market hunting, but I actually have some of his receipts from back in the day. And apparently he did sell turtle meat to the Fulton Fish Market. So I don't know what kind of exemptions there were, but I guess if it's documented, it was legit. So
yeah, in the 20s and 30s, man, I will have to poke you to maybe at least take a picture or send me, one of those receipts. That's a really cool piece of history. And, I myself had, a life before trapping where I spent a lot of time in Manhattan, flying into JFK, like going through Jamaica, Queens, and into the city. It's interesting to think about how, rural that part was in the 20s and 30s, where, you might have potato farms, swamplands, and rats. And it's interesting too, you think about Chelsea and the garment district and, the ties to the garment industry all the way back in the 20s and 30s from muskrats for trim. Like that's actually a pretty interesting historical, like complete full circle. And, that you're kind of gone through now that you're a trapper yourself.
Yeah, it's wild. I mean, luckily, so he passed when I was 4, unfortunately. So that would have been 1981 that he passed. And then a lot of the treasure trove was given to me by my Uncle David. So shout out to Davey. He's the one that kind of mentored me in trapping when I moved to Wisconsin. And when he found out how interested I was, he said, let me see if I can dig up some of your grandfather's stuff, and sent me a bunch of, I got like trapping tags from back in the day. I have a copy of his trapping license from 1936. So some cool stuff. I can send you all kinds of pics of.
I would love that. But, it's kind of interesting, like the generations you're talking about. So, 20s and 30s, there was a market for both fur and apparently snapping turtle meat. Who knew? But, there was a market for it, and you could make, maybe not a great living, but you could put food on the table, literally and figuratively through trapping. And then you mentioned your Uncle Davy, who I'm assuming was probably trapping in the early 80s during the fur boom. That was like I guess, I don't know if you call it second, third, fourth, depending on how you look at history in the United States. But, the last real prime time of fur trapping was the early 80s. And I'm curious, just like, in your conversations with him, was he still in New York when he was trapping in the 80s, or was he kind of a little further out?
He was. So he lived on Long Island by that time, but he would have been trapping upstate New York, which, if you are familiar with the geography there, once you cross the Tappan Zee Bridge, you're in like a different world. You get into like Rockland. I shot my first deer, 40 minutes outside of Manhattan in Orange County. So it changes rapidly. Like, despite what the area is known for, overall it's a good sportsman state. So he would have been making trips upstate, mostly focused on raccoon, which I have receipts from him also from his fur sales. And, it's wild what a raccoon went for in those days. It was like $20. And if you think of, 1979, 1980 money, like that was good money. He bought his first 2 trucks with fur money, from what I understand. So he did pretty well.
You kind of took the question I was about to ask, because I've talked with many folks on this podcast who either themselves or relatives had trapped through the fur boom. And, many like young guys during that time too were buying their first trucks or putting a down payment on a house from selling fur.
Yeah.
It's wild. But, the garment industry really was demanding it at the time, and the prices reflected it. But, do you remember in your conversations with him, like, I know a lot of people who trapped through the fur boom, and then as things tapered off, many people kind of either left the recreation or like extremely pared down their involvement once, fur prices dropped out in the mid 80s. But did you know if your Uncle Davy kind of kept through with it, or did he also kind of taper off a bit?
I think he kept up with it when prices started to decrease. I think, the physical aspect of it probably was a little bit daunting. He's also a hunter. So I think he had, especially before he retired, he probably had to make the choice between devoting his off time to hunting the deer and turkey seasons up there, versus, and keep in mind, checking a trap line, if you're Long Island, New York based, it's not distant as the crow flies, but as far as the traffic, you could be talking about being stuck in 3 or 4 hours of traffic to go up and check a trap line. So I think that kind of all conspired to put the kibosh on that. But he still has the bug. I'll talk to him and tell him about something I caught, and he's like, yeah, like, what'd you use? And it's so. It's in his blood, no matter what, even if he can't go out and pursue it to the same extent, it's still, I don't think you lose that.
Yeah. I think, speaking from my own experience and, just from folks I talk to on a regular basis, and I'm sure you'll probably echo this, is that like once you do get bitten by the trapping bug, it is something that does kind of stick with you, like regardless of your level of like involvement, whether you're trapping for market fur, doing research studies, or just doing it for fun. Like, it is something I tell people all the time, and I say it on this podcast, I'm sure people are sick of hearing it, is, there is no better time travel mechanism in our world than trapping.
Yeah, I mean, it's literally what put this country on the map. People don't realize it, but that's, the first people coming here were fur traders. So it's a very important part of our history. It's a shame how it's portrayed currently, and I'm hoping that the people that are getting into it now, especially a person like myself who came into it late in life, I actually came into it through necessity. Even though I didn't grow up with it having negative connotations, it wasn't something I needed to do or necessarily even wanted to do, but after moving to Wisconsin 7 years ago, I noticed things coming a little bit too close to the house in too great numbers. And, we started getting interested in raising poultry, and it was something that had to happen. And then, found out the neighbors were feeding them sometimes. So that didn't help. I mean, there was a draw there that I was unaware of, but without keeping the populations in check and healthy, it really is kind of, you know, it's not helpful to any of us, whether we're hunters or, just people who like to enjoy nature. You can't have a surplus of some of these animals.
Well, that's a big, great point and a perfect segue. So like, you grew up in, the Queens area, and you were clearly exposed to trapping, like you said, but it was never something you had to do out of necessity. You were probably sitting, so saw Uncle Davey at family stuff and, heard stories about it, but, there wasn't great opportunity without going to like upstate New York, like you mentioned. And that's, obviously time consuming and difficult. So did you have any other trapping exposure outside of that kind of just familial relations between, being a young kid in New York to the time that you moved to Wisconsin 7 years ago?
I did not. No. I mean, I was a hunter before I was a trapper. So I've been hunting since I'm 48 now. I'm here 7 years. So I'm trapping since my early 40s, but I'm hunting since my late 20s, early 30s. So I was a hunter for a good 10 years before that, and had, I'd seen plenty of small game and probably rubbed elbows with wherever there was a confluence of trapping and hunting interests, like, the general outdoors community, but nothing trapping focused.
So we have a very similar undertone of the story, right? Like I didn't get into hunting, and hunting came first for me, like many folks like yourself, in my late 20s. My story is that I'm like the dog who caught up with the car and realized that the lifestyle that had been pushed down my throat of the white picket fence, get your career, get your college degree, it didn't hold the meaning I thought. And that's what kind of pushed me down this path to kind of find something a little more visceral, ultimately hunting, then trapping. What was your story then of like why, a New York kid, very urban, what got you even into hunting in your late 20s?
So I came into the firearms industry mostly by accident in my late 20s. I was 28 when I started working for Henry Repeating Arms in 2005. I had a good amount of retired mill and LE in my family, along with some more hunters than trappers. So I knew the outdoors, and the basic like two-way stuff resonated with me, but it wasn't a real pursuit until I entered the industry. And then my brother-in-law kind of poked me to go out with him, and knew that we had access to firearms at that point, which wasn't a thing for a lot of people in Queens. By that time I was actually living in Brooklyn, New York, which was even more an urban setting. And we, the first couple of hunts were hunts. It was more like a hike with a rifle. Had no idea what we were doing, made every rookie mistake in the book, and we're pretty much self-taught and just kept our ear to the ground, and eventually learned a little bit more about moving through the woods and how to even see game, let alone get a shot at game. Naturally, public land was our only recourse because we didn't know anybody that would open up any private land to us, not knowing what we were doing, which I don't blame them in retrospect, really. And I think it was my third year hunting that my third season I got my first deer, and then it was off to the races.
So I got to ask, did you get it with a lever action rifle, or what did you use to get your first deer?
It was actually a loner bolt gun. The first one should have been with a lever gun, but I missed. That was my second season. And then the third season, I was in a blind, and I was hunting this a break in a stone wall on private property that we had access to, and by way of my Uncle David again. And small buck came out like first light and was almost in my lap. I couldn't believe it was in front of me. I shot before I even realized I shot, and that was my first deer.
Man, what a cool coincidence! And I'm assuming too, or I make the assumption. You can tell me if I'm wrong. Like, eating the meat and everything else like that. At least that was one of the other interests that really got me in my late 20s. Was just the idea of kind of using a lot of the animal.
Yeah, so I've been a home cook for a very long time. I have two kids, and I'm really into the farm to table or woods to table ethos. So the appeal of I'm still a meat hunter to this day. I mean, I've been lucky enough to be on some good hunts and gotten some ancillary trophies, but the meat hunting is really the gist for me. And then when I learned about trapping and kind of like went down that rabbit hole, again, it just made perfect sense. I mean, the fur being an organic source of warmth, and something that's decorative. I mean, this room I'm sitting in has has a bunch of stuff that came off of this property. Um, it just it was a perfect tie-in.
Yeah. So you mentioned too, and I don't want to miss this before we kind of move on to like Wisconsin and you getting into trapping, but you're in New York. You kind of mentioned that you fell into the firearms industry. Like, how did you get tied in with Henry? Like, of all things, like what were you doing before? How did you get in? And like, how did you find that transition to whatever it was before into the firearms industry?
It was random and completely unrelated. I was actually I was going through a divorce and working with who would be my ex mother-in-law, and it was a dental practice, a general dental practice, and I was the office manager. And one of the patients was a Henry employee, so she overheard that I was looking for a job when I was speaking to my friend on my lunch break, and she approached me after her appointment and said, "Hey, if you're looking for a job, my boss might want to meet you." So the current owner, Anthony Imperado's father, Louis, is who I interviewed with, and I had no idea what I was walking into. It was a very nondescript building in an industrial part of Brooklyn near the Gowanus Canal, and it just said, secured by order of NYPD or whatever. And I thought it was like a security job. I had no idea firearms are being manufactured in Brooklyn. So, I walked in, and it's a gun factory, and people moving carts around, en route to test fire and packaging and everything. And so I kind of just literally fell into it. And
Did you feel like a kid walking to like the Willy Wonka chocolate factory? Because too, like the idea that there was manufacturing happening in Brooklyn, like again, myself having spent a lot of time in Manhattan, like that's not, those things don't compute.
No, they don't.
Yeah.
They don't. Yeah, in retrospect, I can't believe it myself. I mean, it's the most random thing in the most random place. But if you saw the area, it was so nondescript. I mean, we were around the corner from where it's like the city garbage truck depot, and there was a scrap metal place, and it was really not a place that invited much foot traffic or any curiosity. So I think we managed to fly under the radar, and then I think also what we were making was regarded as pretty benign. The AWB had just lifted. This was the early 2000s still. Lever guns were not what anybody was really bothered by. So I guess we were, and also our line was almost entirely rimfire at that time. I mean, when I came on, we had a 6-page catalog with the H006 Big Boy series rifle was the only centerfire gun we built at the time. So it was mostly 22 Magnum, and I don't know.
And so what? I'm curious. So like you go from dental office manager to I mean, talk about fate, right? Having this conversation with Anthony's father. And then like, what did he have you do? Like, obviously you must have impressed him with something in the interview, but like, what was that conversation like? And then he's like, okay, yeah, are you going to be a test firer? Or like, what did he have you doing?
Yeah. So Anthony's thing from the beginning was always customer service. So they were hungry for more people on the phone. It was, it was even before, it's wild to imagine, but it was even before the exchange of emails was common, especially for our demographic, like older rural guys that were like the bulk of our sales they were just not firing emails back and forth. So it was a lot of like we would get a ton of handwritten mail with, checks and handwritten orders for caps and t-shirts. And then it was very heavy phones. They were, Lou and Anthony both were big on the connection to the consumer and phones and travel. I put myself up for every assignment that would possibly come my way that nobody else wanted to do. I was game for. So it was off to the races.
We have another through thread too. You said that you were coming out of a divorce and that was in your kind of late 20s. That's exactly what happened to me and how I ended up in Idaho in my late 20s. So, there's more commonalities there, but that's awesome. So you started in customer service, and I'm going to go off on a limb. Like, I know there's a huge manufacturing facility now for Henry Repeating Arms in Wisconsin. Mm-hmm. Is it a safe assumption to say that you had the bulk of your career in Brooklyn, and then as a lot of the manufacturing shifted to Wisconsin, that's what drew you out this way?
So I started in 2005. The company started in 97. So they were in Brooklyn for 8 years before I came on. Then we moved to Bayonne, New Jersey in 2008 because we needed more manufacturing space. I mean, if you'd seen the Brooklyn operation was minuscule. It was just, jammed to the gills. So we moved to Bayonne, New Jersey for more manufacturing capacity. And our Golden Boy series used a component that was manufactured by a door hardware company in Rice Lake. They turned out they were being shut down completely and the assets sold off. They were owned by a UK conglomerate of some kind. And Anthony was faced with the choice of either sourcing the component elsewhere or buying the operation because they had all the tooling. So he chose the latter, assuming that we would either grow there or, there would be another business that came of it. So their general manager, Andy Wickstrom, who's currently our president, was basically instrumental in getting Rice Lake, Wisconsin up and running and producing parts for us. As we expanded our line, they would produce more and more components. And then we got to a point in Bayonne, New Jersey, where we were kind of hitting our ceiling with manufacturing space. So we started having some final assembly come from Rice Lake, Wisconsin. Then I think it was 2017 or 2018, we officially moved headquarters on paper out to Rice Lake, Wisconsin. And it was kind of an organic situation where I think the machining capability and the technical knowledge was mostly in Wisconsin, and New Jersey was more final assembly. And we just steadily grew in the Rice Lake facility, whereas a lot of the SKUs that we were making in New Jersey, they started to reach a bit more of a maturity. Mm-hmm. Than what we were coming out with in Rice Lake, Wisconsin was a little bit more, just by way of being new, it was with the current marketplace in mind. So as that grew, we actually closed the Bayonne, New Jersey facility this past April.
Oh wow!
That was very bittersweet. I mean, I remember bringing stuff in and bringing it out was kind of disheartening, but it was just a sign of the times.
Yeah. And I guess, like you said, it's interesting to me. I'd love, if you're up for it, a little bit of the history, because, when I think about Henry Repeating Arms, it's hard to believe the company as it is today was founded in 1997, just with the history of the lever guns. It seems like it would have stretched back way, way further. You might give us a little bit of a recalling of the history of how it came to be, but it was interesting is that you said through the time in New Jersey to the time of the acquisition of the company in Rice Lake, at what point did you guys really start expanding into centerfire? Because I feel that lever actions are kind of reaching their, I don't want to say their peak, but it's becoming more in vogue now. It's definitely becoming it's becoming popular again, I guess is the best way to put it. Even the 4570 is coming back as kind of a popular round. I've seen like your collaborations with like Charlie Benton, the guys at Field Ethos. Like there's a lot of really cool stuff of, people wanting to trick out their lever action. So I'd love to know a little bit about the history of it. And then like, at what point did you start to expand your catalog? Because you said you had a small, rimfire focus, but now you look at the catalog today and you guys are covering so much.
Yeah, so again, a random and the most unlikely story. Anthony's father, Lou, he had been in the business since I believe, the 50s, and they used to import, before the Gun Control Act, a West German rifle. It was a 22 lever gun made by Irma that is kind of the predecessor to our H001, and they'd been through a few different firearms businesses. They owned Ivor Johnson at one point and manufactured in New Jersey, as well as a large distributor of mainly handguns called John Jovino that was started as a cop shop in Lower Manhattan, and then they ended up becoming a fairly large handgun distributor. So when they founded Henry Repeating Arms, Anthony probably, well, he would know if the name came before the gun, but either way, they wanted to build this clone, and Anthony researched the name, and it turned out to not be taken by anybody and trademarked. So that's how we acquired the name. It was just through searching. So the H001 was that Irma gun, basically, with a few improvements. And then the numbers were sequential for a while and still are to some extent. But, now we're up to H27, which, there's a little bit of jumping around. But I guess when we moved into the New Jersey facility in 2008, we were still primarily a rimfire manufacturer. And I think, a lot of it was just by the way of consumer demand. We got to a period where Winchester had closed their doors in Connecticut. I think Moroku was still yet to take up manufacturing of some of the classic line. Marlin went through some trouble. They closed their doors, and before being acquired by Remington, were out of production for a while. So with those openings, we had more consumer demand for 3030. That was our next offering, which became the H009 series. And shortly thereafter, 4570 calls grew to the extent that we couldn't ignore them any longer. So that became the H10 series. And then it really just went along in the same vein for a while. We listened to consumer demand and would mine data, and that's how we ended up with a 9mm carbine and a revolver and all the other disparate action types and platforms we offer now. It's none of them could have been predicted in 2005.
Yeah, I mean, what a cool story too. But what was it that got you to Wisconsin? I mean, obviously your job, but like, has most everything left then, like the New Jersey, New York area? Like, I know all the manufacturing's pretty much closed down, but like, was it, hey, this is an opportunity to move to Wisconsin, I want to take it? Or was it like, hey, this is where operations are now and I need to be out there?
Well, Anthony knew my sentiments on New York. As my kids were getting older, I would spend more and more of my weekends upstate, I moved from Brooklyn to New Jersey to be closer to the Bayonne, New Jersey facility. And the location of that, if you look at the map, it's pretty easy to access upstate New York, northern New Jersey, Pennsylvania, all of which offer a lot of outdoor recreational opportunities. So both of my girls are into fishing and hiking. So we really, as time went on and Anthony realized I was spending more of my downtime outside of the city, I think he threw me a bone and just said, "Hey, what do you think of moving to Wisconsin?" And thought grew on me, and I've been doing a lot of travel since I entered the industry too, so I'm familiar with a lot of the country, and I knew a little bit about the Midwest and knew for sure that I wanted to live in a rural area when it was all said and done. So, yeah, I mean, he planted the acorn, which became an oak tree, and before I knew it, I was out here being a city slicker and trying to figure out how to getting here was one thing. Learning how to live here was another thing altogether.
What outside of, I want to get into the trapping here soon, but I want to also ask, like, what was the biggest culture shock, both for you and, like, how old were your daughters when you got out to Wisconsin?
My oldest was 15 and Ooh. My youngest was 10.
Okay. That's a interesting age to move from, the city out there. How was that perceived in the family?
My 10-year-old, I think she's similar to me. She's, she's bookish and kind of introverted, and I don't think the New York City school system was really her speed, which was something that I recognized early, and I think I wanted her to have the benefit of going to school in a small town. So she took to it like a fish to water. I mean, or duck to water. She flourished here, and enjoys the outdoors. The older one, she actually is a New York City art student now, so that tells you what you need to know about that.
Yeah, so she made her way back, but that's awesome. So then you get out there, you've got a little bit of land. At what point are you calling Uncle Davey and being like, I think I need to trap some critters?
So I knew when I signed on the house that we had deer on the property, and actually we had cats too, because there were some bobcat tracks in the woods, which I haven't seen since. But I set up a deer stand that first season. My 10-year-old actually shot a deer with a crossbow out of that stand. And then during the late season, I saw a yote come. I mean, it must have been within 15 feet of the house, broad daylight, like 9:30 in the morning, and just kind of like hang out. And we've since added another larger dog, but at the time we had this, West Highland Terrier who was all of 20 pounds and thinks he's 100 pounds, but he's not. So I made the decision then and there to try to figure that out, and ordered a trap on eBay, stuck it in the ground, and made every rookie mistake one can possibly make. And long story short, educated a yote that I'd never caught to this day.
Yeah, it's probably still sitting there laughing. So when you went on eBay, like, did you have a little bit of intel from Davey, like what to get? Like, were you ordering like a foothold trap? Like, what were you going, or what were you leveraging?
I hadn't spoken to him yet. I did a little bit of like YouTubing. I know early days I came across like Coon Creek Outdoors, who ended up being very, like, even down the road. Like, I mean, I can still watch his stuff and learn something that I didn't know before. Yeah, I'm a pretty like voracious reader, so I went right down the rabbit hole. I mean, I was grabbing like, fur fish and game articles, Tom Miranda stuff from the 80s. I mean, like literally anything I could get my hands on, I was reading and watching, and incrementally getting better and better. I'm still a lousy yote trapper, but I finally figured out red fox, which initially were even harder, to be honest. I mean, I had a fox digging me up for like 3 weeks. Like, I just couldn't figure him out. I mean, but he knew exactly what my game was.
So you had the yote first, you got a trap, put it in the ground, educated the yote, never saw him again. Then, like, what was the first animal trapping that you connected with?
Raccoons. Okay. Like, by the boatload.
That's pretty good.
Yeah, I mean, they were, first, my first one was a foothold, which I had set for canine.
Yep.
And that was a back foot catch. Big boar coon that I have actually on the wall in this room. And then, so as a landowner in Wisconsin, the laws are pretty liberal with trapping nuisance critters. So I trapped through the late season, which, during the mating season seemed to be like when I was most successful, using dog proofs and later live traps when the snow melted. And I was just catching so many that I couldn't hope to keep up with them. And in the interest of doing something other than just giving them an outdoor burial, like I wanted to figure out the tanning component, and that's how they ended up becoming wall hangs, which also ended up becoming more numerous, and they became giveaways as time went on. But yeah, in the beginning, I tried to, skinning was a thing to figure out. Fleshing was another thing altogether to figure out. Pickling, tanning, it was all a learning curve. But I'm to the point now where I can produce a nice looking product. But that was not the case until the 10th or 12th one for sure.
Oh yeah, when trying to figure out the pH balance, trying not to put a hole in the skin every time. But
oh yeah.
But when you caught that first raccoon in the foothold that you had out for a canine, do you remember what that was the first time you walked up? Obviously, it was a canine, but remember that, like, oh shit, I actually caught something.
Yeah, it was the Christmas morning feeling that I think keeps all trappers coming back to this. I mean, it was, I expected, it was deliberate. Of course, I put a trap there, so I hope to catch something. But when you first connect, it's kind of like what I remember my first deer being. I was there to shoot one, but like couldn't believe I finally did. And then it was like, all right, what's next, or even what I caught. In fact, it was kind of like an overcast morning, and there was still snow on the ground, but he had really dug like a huge catch circle around it, and he was all covered in mud. So from a distance, we couldn't figure out what he was. And actually went up on this. There's a ridge on our property that is like by far the most productive spot. There's it's an ATV trail on the neighbor's side, and on one side is rotating corn or beans, depending on the season, and then there's a wood line and a game trail coming through the wood line. And it's like, I had no idea at the time that you're looking for all those features and where they converge, but it was like such a great producing spot, and still is. But I had a trap set there, and we couldn't identify what it was from a distance, and both went up onto this ridge together. And she was like, "It's a raccoon," and I mean, he was big, and he was pissed. Like,
yeah.
he wanted out of there, and so.
So you see that, then you go to your safe and you have your stable of weapons. Like, what was your tool of choice for dispatching on your trap line?
22 lever gun for sure. That was, I mean, I knew that before I caught my first one, like, what I wanted to use. I specifically had these CCI quiets that I played around with. I played around with CB longs a little bit just to try to keep the noise down. I can't see my neighbors, but they're within like gunshot range. They can hear. So I was assuming that it would be early morning, and I'd want to be as quiet as possible.
Yeah, well, that's awesome. Yeah, and for those listening, I know I talked to so many trappers. Everybody's kind of got their go-to. I use a little 22 lever action. I also have a little suppressed pistol too. When I'm doing like some live trapping. But I have a lot of people who love their Henrys and their 22 rimfire guns. So it's a pretty cool through line knowing that that's out there and on the trap lines for folks.
Yeah, and just the versatility of it. I mean, I was shooting everything from 22 shorts and CB longs, CCI quiet, mini mags. I mean, to this day, there's a 22 lever gun in the kitchen that is, the go-to gun. I mean, I can't tell you how many skunks and fox and red squirrels and incidental stuff that ran by that, that gun has taken.
Yeah, that's awesome. So then you start to do that, you graduate. At what point do you kind of graduate and actually start to connect on some fox and coyotes?
So yotes, I've never figured out to this day, full disclosure.
Fair enough. I mean, That and wolves, that's a lifelong pursuit, man. God bless anybody who has that dialed in.
Yeah, the one that I ended up connecting with was incidental, and it was during archery season, and it ended up being crossbowed, and it came through the underbrush, and I couldn't even make out what it was at first. It was still, fairly early morning, low light, and then she ended up clearing for literally a split second, and I did like just off the top of my head like a couple of mouth squeak, hissing sounds, and she stopped just long enough to get one broadside, and that was the only one I connected with. And then I did so. I had a set which I was pretty proud of. I thought it was one of my best ones that I ever put in, and I had a camera set up on the same trail, and part of me thought about, like, should I put the camera on or not, and decided not to. Came back a day later and switched it on. Well, I see a couple of days later when I pulled the card that this yoke came in like a on a string. I mean, nose to the ground, straight to the dirt hole. And as soon as the camera glowed, it jumped like 30 feet in the air, spun around, and took off running. So learned not to make that mistake again. And then I had a pullout. I think it was last season. Only, it had to be a yote. I mean, nothing. There was ice on the ground, so I didn't see any tracks. But it wrapped around a tree and managed to pull itself out. But it did pretty well on red fox by this time, and caught my first gray, which I understand are not that common here in the Northwoods. Talked to a couple of guys at work, and they had never even seen one. People that grew up here and lived here for 30 years and had never seen a gray fox.
Wow. And so that you kind of touched on, like, one of the favorite questions I like to ask is like, what's your biggest mistake you've made on the trap line? You mentioned one or two there, and like I have everything, like every single thing I do seems to be a mistake, but it's something you learn from. But switching to the fur shed, you mentioned how hard it is to kind of get dialed in. Like, do you remember what the biggest mistake you made in the fur shed was as you were kind of coming up to speed?
Yeah, punching holes through raccoon bellies for sure. That was I'm to the point now where I can process a skunk or a raccoon without, well, I say it now, and next year we'll see what happens, but I can do one now to the point where I don't make any holes. But initially figuring that out was tough. Just the whole the pressure thing, and learning the technique, and as a hunter, I'd spent enough time in the field processing deer and bear to pretty much figure out the skinning of the face. So I wasn't bad at faces. Turning ears was tough in the beginning. It took me a while to figure that out. In fact, my first the coyote that I shot with the crossbow, I had hair slip on the back of the ears because I couldn't figure out how to turn them properly. And between that and then being too wet while it was tanning, I had some fur slip there. But I mean, all of it. The gray fox, I ended up doing a tube skin with to use as a wall hang. So I skinned the feet out, and that's one of the ones I'm most proud of. I mean, it took me a good long time versus a guy that handles more fur than I do, but getting the feet skinned out was another learning curve.
Yeah, I mean, that's hard. I've done that on otters before, and it's difficult. But again, this podcast is largely focused towards, I mean, obviously seasoned trappers, but also people who are interested in getting into it. And I think that's a great anecdote for people, those that are listening who maybe aren't trappers yet, or maybe are but are afraid of the fur shed. Like, you're only going to learn by doing a lot of it. That's the sad reality. Like, the more you do, the better you'll get, and you got to practice, and you're going to punch holes and stuff, and you're going to screw it up, but that is the only way.
It's a hands-on thing, and it's also, I've figured out there isn't a one-size-fits-all set of tools. Like, you can watch, like Coon Creek is a perfect example, right? Like, he's got his tools laid out, and it's stuff that works perfectly for him. and he's done it so much that, he makes it look effortless. And, then somebody like myself, that same style of knife doesn't feel the same. And, I've tried every knife pattern there is out there, and you eventually find out what works for you. And it might look unlike what you'd think anybody's trapping tool set would look like. It might be a screwdriver, or a butter knife, and a and a kitchen knife, but it's whatever works for you. But definitely has to be sharp.
100%. Yeah, my first skinning exercises on canines, I remember having my iPad propped up with Stu from Coon Creek, and same thing. You get a knife out and you're trying to run it like that blade style he uses, and like you said, his looks effortless, and you're jamming your knife and ripping spur, and you're like, what is happening? But you're right. Like, it does take that feeling it out, trying different things, being okay with improvising, frankly, and seeing what works for you. And eventually you'll find something that does.
The tail stripper was the big one for me. I mean, I can't tell you how many animals I made look like poodles by, just that last. I think it's a confidence thing. You just have to like grip it and rip it.
Yep.
And if you don't have the right technique, you end up with all kinds of like janky results. But then because I was having lousy success with that, I went to skinning the whole thing out with a knife, like straight down, and ended up with like flattened skunk and foxtails that just would never like puff out because they'd get like kind of like overstretched. And it you learn from the mistakes. You really have to do it and just get in there. And I mean, from the beginning, I would take every raccoon, even if I knew it wasn't necessarily a keeper, and small raccoons or bobtail raccoons, off color ones, just to try to get it down.
Yeah, well, that's a good call for everybody listening. So it's surprising, but we're already coming up, getting close to the top of the hour. So I've kind of got one last big question for you, and then I have a few quick hitters. But just in your experience, adult onset trapper, you're now in Wisconsin. You've been exposed to trapping from your grandfather back in the Depression era through to your uncle in the 80s, now to yourself, just kind of, maintaining your property in Wisconsin. But I'm sure you see everything going on around the country with the bad light around trapping. But if you had your crystal ball, what do you see as the future of trapping in the U.S.?
Some of the recent trapping centric magazines I've looked at seem like they're trying more outreach to women. And as a father of daughters who recreate in the outdoors, I think that's a wise move. It's a demographic that, also being in the shooting industry, I've seen cultivated. And, women, a lot of times you can take the ego aspect out of the equation a little bit, and they're excellent learners and teachers, and I think that's potentially a way for us to gain more exposure, and just the realistic benefits of it to everyone. It is something that we have to manage for everything from property damage to disease. These animals are vectors for rabies, plague. I mean, you name it, a skunk or a fox carries it. And, people don't even realize that this stuff is running around outside their house while they sleep. But, raccoons, their droppings spread roundworms all over your property. Your kids could be playing out there. So, you really want to keep all these populations in check.
I think it's a beautiful answer. So now the two quick hitters. So I asked two questions, everybody. One you'll get right now, and the other one is a specific hypothetical for you. But the first one is, I'll expand this just to the wildest experience, because I know growing up in Manhattan, there might be some interesting stuff. The normal question is, what is the wildest experience you've had in the woods? But for you, I'm going to make it a little more broad. Like, just what's the wildest experience you've had in your life?
Oh. I don't know that I have a single one. I mean, I grew up in Queens writing graffiti in subway tunnels. So, probably almost getting hit by a train is the first one that comes to mind. I wouldn't be here to trap if I hadn't gotten out of that one.
And any more detail on it? Was it like in a subway tunnel, tagging stuff, and then?
Yeah, it was long before September 11th when jumping down onto the tracks and walking into a subway tunnel didn't raise as many eyebrows, and people
Mm-hmm.
kind of, the old school New York, like, see no evil, hear no evil thing.
Mm-hmm.
And so my friend and I were in a subway tunnel, and the trains come in on various tracks, and we ended up not being on the right track, and if not for being able to flatten against the wall, we wouldn't have made it out.
Oh, so you sucked up against the wall while this sucker, like, how many train cars was it? Like, I guess how long were you puckered for before you realized that you were not, rapping on heaven's gates?
It was the length of a full, NYC. I think it was probably the F or the G train. So I don't know how many cars long it is, but the length of a train station.
Long enough, I'm sure.
Felt longer.
Yeah. Did you guys just look at each other afterwards and like touch everything, make sure you were all there, and then just like hightail it out of the tunnel?
Yeah, there was quite a bit of that, but it's also, when you're a kid, you're that air of invincibility, and it's not until you have your own kids and you have a few aches and pains that you realize that you're actually mortal. So I think we probably stayed a little bit stupid for a couple of years thereafter, but eventually grew out of it, thankfully.
Oof. Okay. So final question, hypothetical. Would you rather run a week-long trap line with just a 22 lever action and all the gear you can carry, or would you rather carry a 47 old, but your line cuts through grizzly?
Probably the former, just because of the surprise element.
Yep.
If I'm on a big game hunt, I know what I'm there for, and I hope to connect. But when I do connect, it is not a surprise because I was there looking for that specific animal. Whereas on the trap line, I could have picked up 5-6 different species, and each one would have been a surprise.
Awesome. Well, Tom, first and foremost, thank you for taking the time. I learned a lot. I love the history. I want you to send me some photos of some of the receipts from Grandpa in the Depression era in New York. But where can people learn more, either about you or Henry Repeating Arms? Like, what would you suggest for folks who are looking for a dispatch gun? People getting into trapping, like, where should they start in your catalog, and anything else you want to plug?
So website is henryusa.com, and under firearms we have plenty of lever guns. I would suggest people, especially for a trap gun, I'm not going to sit here and plug the anniversary models or the tribute editions. I'd say your standard H001 is probably your best bet. If you need any kind of personal advice or anything like that, I'm Tom at henryusa.com, and I answer hundreds of emails a week. I'd always be happy to help.
Cool. All right, everybody. Well, I appreciate your time, Tom. And for everybody listening, we'll catch you on another episode of the Okayest Trapper podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Zach. Have a good one.
You too.
Thanks.